Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Italian breakfast strata. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make one of the best breakfast casseroles ever, and certainly the best one named after a rock formation. And by the way, for the first time in history, a video recipe is being dedicated to geologists who will have no idea, but still. And to get started, what we'll do is take a big loaf of French or Italian bread, and we will cut this into 1-inch slices, and then we'll eventually cut those slices into strips, and then finally into about 1-inch cubes. And by the way, this is a 1.5 pound loaf, and it's probably going to give us a little more than we need. But for this recipe, I find a 1 pound loaf not quite enough. So if you have to use 1.5 loaves, go ahead. And like I said, we'll do 1-inch cubes, although that's going to be up to you. But be careful not to go too much bigger, otherwise things are going to be harder to layer. But no matter the size, once we're done with our cubist phase, we'll spread everything out into a nice even layer, and then we'll let it sit on the counter overnight so it gets a little bit stale. Okay, you don't want to do this with fresh bread or really dry hard bread. So I find leaving it out overnight works perfectly. But if your bread's already stale, you could probably skip this step. And then when we're ready to start our strata, if we're going to use sausage, which I always am, we will add that to a pan with a little bit of olive oil set over medium-high heat. And we'll go ahead and break that up into small crumbles and wait for it to lose its raw appearance and start to brown up a little bit. And once that happens, that's our cue to toss in our diced onion. And we could also, if we want, add some garlic, but my sausage had plenty, so I didn't. And then we'll season this up with a nice big pinch of salt, as well as some freshly ground black pepper, a few shakes of cayenne, and then a trio of dried Italian herbs, including some rosemary, some thyme, and oregano. And once all that's in there, we will cook this stirring for another 2 or 3 minutes or so, or until those onions start to soften up and turn translucent, and our pieces of sausage brown up a little bit more. And once we're happy with how everything is looking, and right about here I was very happy, we'll pull that off the heat and transfer that mixture into a bowl, and then we'll put the pan back on the stove with about a tablespoon of that sausage fat, and we'll turn our heat back on to medium-high, and we'll transfer in a 1 pound container of baby spinach. And yes, that's just going to barely fit, but that's fine, as long as we can place a lid on, or cover it with a pan for a few seconds. That spinach is going to collapse quickly, at which point we can toss it around with our tongs until it finishes wilting and turns a nice bright green. And yes, this is easier in a big soup pot, which is how we usually do it. But the pan was already dirty, and by dirty I mean flavored with delicious sausage and onions. So here it just makes sense to use that. And once our spinach does wilt to this point, which is only going to take a minute, we will transfer that into a strainer where we will let it cool. And as usual, eventually we'll squeeze out the water and then chop this up. Although let me show you a tip, since I usually don't chop. Oh no, I usually take some scissors and give this the old snippa, which is a really nice, fast, and easy way to do this. But anyway, as long as you squeeze out the water and somehow chop this up, it doesn't matter. And once we have our meat and veggie components prepped, we can move on to what is a very simple milk custard, which will include 12 large eggs. And as you can see, 4 were from one carton and 8 were from another, hence the different color yolks. And we will toss in some salt and give this a quick mix. And I forget why the yolks are different colors from different chickens. I think it might be the diet, or maybe their mood. But anyway, no matter what it is, we'll give that a quick mix before we add our milk. Since if you add milk to whole unbeaten eggs and then try to mix it, the problem is milk will splash out of the bowl 100% of the time. And I like to think one of my jobs is to make sure you have less problems. And that's it. Once that's set, we can move on to the building of our strata, which we'll start by adding a layer of our stale bread cubes to a casserole dish that we've generously greased with olive oil. And what we want here is full coverage, with basically a single layer of fairly tightly packed cubes. Right, these don't have to be super tight, but I don't think we want any spaces in between. And then what we'll do is grab our sausage mixture and apply that over the top. And classically, we would use half the mixture here and then half for the next layer. But personally, I like to go with 60% on the first layer and then 40% on the final layer. So that's what I did. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing with the spinach. And that's it. Once just over half of both those components have been placed over, I'm going to top this with half our shredded cheese, which for me is a fontal, which is a type of fontina, which would be a very popular and delicious cheese to use for this. So that's what I recommend. But there are a lot of other cheeses that would work, like maybe a mixture of Monterey Jack and a mild cheddar. Just please don't use straight mozzarella, which has little to no flavor. And that's it. Once that's been cheesed, we'll go ahead and repeat the exact same process by placing down another tightly packed but single layer of cubes. And like I said, you might have a few too many. And if you do, you just simply save those and toast them up and use them for croutons in your next salad. And then just like the first layer, we'll top this with the rest of our sausage and then the rest of our spinach. But before we apply the last of our cheese, we will take a ladle and we will transfer our egg and milk mixture over the top, which we could probably just pour right from the bowl. But I feel a little bit better if we ladle this over thoughtfully so as to get a nice uniform saturation. And that's it. We'll finish up by scattering over the rest of our cheese. At which point I have to give you some terrible news. What we need to do is wrap this up and pop it in the fridge overnight before we bake it, since this really is the secret to a perfect strata. Right, we're not just given time for that bread to soak in the custard. We are given those bread cubes time to become one with the custard, as in they're going to merge together and become a whole new wonderful substance. So I wrapped that and popped it in the fridge for 12 hours, at which point we'll pull it out, and it's going to look pretty much exactly the same. But trust me, it's not. And that's it. This is now ready to transfer into the center of a 350-degree oven for about an hour and 15 minutes. And yes, I do like to put a pan underneath in case there's drips. And we'll bake that until the top is lightly browned and things have puffed up a little bit. And we've hopefully hit an internal temp of 150 at least. And yes, I agree that looks completely gorgeous. And we want to eat right now, but we probably shouldn't. All right, let's let this rest at least 10 to 15 minutes before we serve up. And then as far as portioning goes, this will make anywhere between 6 gigantic servings to 12 smaller. I wish there was a little more servings. All right, personally, I cut this into 8ths since I think that's a really nice size. So that's what I'm doing here. And that's it. We'll go ahead and serve that up next to a nice prop salad. And after cleaning up the plate and taking a bunch of contractually obligated pictures, I grabbed a fork and dug in to what is probably the best breakfast you're not currently eating. All right, this, my friends, has everything. All right, it's super flavorful with a fantastic texture. And while fairly rich and satisfying, it is definitely not heavy. And of course, there's lots of different versions, some with more bread, some with more custard. All right, more or less meat and veggies, more or less cheese. So if you enjoy this, feel free to play around with those proportions. I mean, you guys are after all the ratios of your ingredient ratios. And speaking of goodnight sweet prince, the next time you're thinking about breakfast for dinner, I cannot think of a better choice than this. But no matter when you serve it, or how you adapt it to your taste, like I said in the intro, this is one of the best breakfast casseroles of all time. And on behalf of myself and geologists everywhere, I'd like to say we really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.